In the last video, we talked about the characteristics of verbal communication. In this video, we're going to look at the functions of verbal communication. So let's start off with the first one, sharing meaning. I had a student one time say, wouldn't it be easier if we could just send brainwaves over to other people and they could just understand what we mean without us even having to say a single word? And I thought, yes, that would be easier if it were possible. We would have less misunderstandings because people would just be able to peek into our brains and get it. But it's not that simple. We haven't developed or even learned that type of skill. And so we use verbal communication to share meaning with other people. When we first think about a word, we usually think about the denotative meaning, the dictionary definition of the word. For example, dog, D-O-G. If I were to look up in the dictionary, what is a dog? It would probably say a canine, four-legged animal that goes roof roof, that's often domesticated as a pet. But the connotative meaning is going to shape really how you see the word in your own being. Whether that's your own personal experience with the word, whether you see dog as something cute and fluffy, or that big terrible beast that scared you when you were a child. Or maybe you even use the word dog as slang to talk negatively about people. Again, it's going to be shaped by your own personal experiences, and even sometimes about the context. We also need to think about how words are shaping our thoughts, or even how our thoughts are shaping our words. This leads us to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that language shapes the way we think and determines what we can think about. Now, this has been a hotly debated idea. Edward Sapir conducted a study on Native American language in the early 1900s. And Sapir argued that language is really going to be our main way of sharing meaning with other people, and so it's going to shape how we see those people, how we see our relationships, and even how we see our world. Years later, his protege, Benjamin Lee Whorf, really worked on Sapir's ideas and came up with this hypothesis. Essentially, our entire world and how we think is limited to our vocabulary. If we don't know a word for a particular experience, then we can't share it with other people. We can't even understand it because there's not a word for it. Now, this view is known as linguistic determinism. And as I mentioned, this has been debated many a times by scholars, wondering, well, are we really just at the mercy of our language? Is our entire thinking limited by our vocabulary? Be aware that we have seen probably the biggest support for linguistic determinism when it comes down to different languages colliding. Sometimes there's just not a perfect word in the other language. I can't tell you how many times I've talked with somebody who speaks Spanish as their first language and they said, well, it means this, but not really. And so maybe there's something about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that really does ring true. Because when we look at people from different cultures and how they perceive their world, we realize that people perceive things differently based on that language. And this is going to lead us to the idea of linguistic relativity. Also think about the way that language functions to name things. The act of naming is a purely human idea. It's how we create the symbol for an object. Somebody looked at that four-legged canine animal and said dog. Someone gave you a name. Probably your parents, grandparents, maybe friends of the family. But in some way, that name had power. It affected how people saw you. Maybe you're a junior, and so everyone thought, you're going to be just like your dad. Or maybe even you had to rename yourself through the process of gaining a nickname. Maybe you changed your name legally. Maybe you married into a different family and decided, I'm going to add their name to my name. Even words have changed. When we think about how we name ourselves, our identities, whether it be our race, our gender, our sex, our sexual orientation, our religion, our political affiliation, the list goes on and on, honestly, but we are naming ourselves in some way to be a part of a larger group. And that speaks power. Also keep in mind that language performs actions because it enables us to take action, whether it be to make requests, to command people to do things for us, or even to invite people. Now, also be aware that when we perform language, we can influence others' behaviors. Whether that be telling your little kid to shh, be quiet. Maybe it is, I don't think you really want to do that. Are you sure? And then your best friend says, no, I'm not sure. Maybe I shouldn't do it. Our language has a lot of power to shape how we take action or how we influence others to take action or not take action. So every time we do this, it's called a speech act. Be aware that all of our little speech acts are crafting conversations. Now, to have a full-blown conversation, it has to be interactive. There has to be at least 2 or more people interacting with each other. Both people must take turns. If it's just one person talking, then it's really just a monologue. Secondly, conversations need to be locally managed. What do I mean by that? Well, the people in the conversation are going to decide, well, how long should people talk? How often should we change turns? Now, this separates it from a debate, where there's formal rules about how long you speak, or even the order in which you speak, or even maybe a drama, a play that you perform, where everything's pre-written down. Conversation is universal. No matter what culture you go to, no matter what environment, everyone's having conversations. This is a universal no matter what. And also, lastly, communication adheres to scripts. There's just certain things that you expect after you say certain words and certain phrases. If I say hello, how are you? You're probably going to say, I'm fine, how are you? Usually, people don't answer that and say, oh, well, I've had an actually horrible day. There's something off about that, isn't it? When someone says, I've had a horrible day and goes on about it, when you just said, hello, how are you? Not expecting an actual sad, how are you response. Or even something really off the wall, when you say, hello, how are you? And someone says, banana. That doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't adhere to any scripts. If you've ever seen The Big Bang Theory, there's a particular episode where Sheldon Cooper plots out a conversation because he wants to befriend Barry Kripke. And he goes through a little chart and formulates an algorithm on, if Barry says this, then I will say this. Essentially, that's what we're doing, except we don't have a chart. And then the last function. Verbal communication helps manage our relationships. Think about it. That person that you meet for the very first time, the relationship won't get started unless you say something. Hello, how are you? What's your name? That's how we make friends. That's how we start dating and get into romantic relationships. Then, after time, we start to develop and maintain those relationships through more verbal communication. Whether it be having self-disclosure and telling people more things about ourselves, or even having relationship talk, which we'll talk about in a few more chapters. And even in some cases, verbal communication helps us end the relationship. Sorry, but it's over, or this isn't working out for me anymore. All other functions of verbal communication. So we've looked at a pretty wide experience of how verbal communication operates in our everyday life. In the next video, we'll look at, well, how can we be cooperative with our verbal communication?